All right. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jonas, and I work at Chainbound. We're currently working on Bolt. Okay, introduction is gone. But this was originally tailored towards node operators only, but we decided to expand the scope a little bit to make it interesting for everyone. So I'm going to start with a quick recap of what preconfirmations are and what Bolt is, just to set the stage for talking about why they are useful and why they are interesting, as well as why Bolt and why we took certain decisions that we did in designing it. In the fourth part, we'll talk about how it works, a bit more in depth. In the fifth part, we'll talk about the future, and finally, recent developments and the Holesky testnet. So what is a inclusion preconfirmation? In essence, it's a commitment from a proposer in the look-ahead, anywhere between 32 and 64 slots ahead, that they will include a certain transaction in their slot. The commitment is made credible by economic security and is objectively verifiable. This is something that we take very seriously. We want everything to be objectively verifiable because of the economic security and the potential slashing involved if anything is breached. Also important to note is that inclusion preconfirmations are completely compatible with PBS. So block construction sort of happens collaboratively between the proposer and the builder. You can think of this similar to same slot inclusion lists. So in a diagram, we have a user that wants their transaction to be pre-confirmed. What they do is they sign a transaction with a somewhat higher priority fee, and they send that to one of the proposers that is opted into this protocol. That proposer will evaluate the transaction validity so that they don't commit to anything that's invalid. And they will also evaluate the fee because they want to make some money out of this. When they've evaluated the fee and they like it, they will sign a commitment. And again, I want to reiterate, the proposer has some collateral that by signing this transaction, they put that collateral at risk if they don't include it in their slot. Now, what this looks like from an off-chain perspective, very quickly, there's not a whole lot that changes. There's one added component, which we call the Bolt sidecar, that handles basically the meat of the protocol and accepts commitments from users and turns them into constraints. Constraints are messages that you send down the PBS pipeline to tell the builder, like, hey, these are the transactions that I have committed to, and they need to be included in the block. Otherwise, there's a problem. We've extended the MEV Boost API with these endpoints for communicating constraints, as well as a modified get header with proofs call, just so to make it completely objective, the sidecar can verify any incoming proofs of constraint validity. So let's talk about why inclusion preconfirmations are interesting. We see them as essentially two new primitives. One of them being the instant response, which if we design the protocol well, and if you trust a commitment, which is sort of interlinked, you can take that commitment as if the transaction was already included. This is very similar to how credit card payments work today. You've probably heard this analogy, but if you make a transaction on a credit card, the money isn't actually immediately settled. It's sort of kept there and then settled at a later stage with the banks, but you take that transaction as if it happened because you trust the credit card company. And this is a similar mechanism. The second primitive is guaranteed settlement. So currently on Ethereum, you don't have this. If you want to get your transaction on chain, you either send it to the mempool or you send it to a block builder, but none of those two methods give you any guarantee about when your transaction is going to be included. And so to offset that, you will likely add a significantly higher priority fee than you need to in order to get into the next block. And we believe that with a Bolt-enabled future, where users can communicate directly with all of the proposers in the look-ahead, this can enable stuff like guaranteed settlement. And I think that's super interesting to explore more. So what do these things give you? First, better UX for users, right? The instant response part. More revenue for for validators, and we'll talk more on this later. And interestingly, also an additional lane for transaction inclusion that you can pay for. So it's sort of similar to a financialized inclusion list in that sense. Now, inclusion preconfirmations for us, that's the primitive that we started with. Why do we think, like from an infra perspective, they make a lot of sense? Well, because they require minimal sophistication on the proposer side. There's one additional sidecar that's extremely lightweight, and pricing is easy, or relatively easy. The only thing you need to account for when pricing an inclusion preconf is that if the block you propose would be fully packed with transactions that pay more than that single transaction, that's the only case in which you actually made a loss. So we believe that it's easier to price. And it's also not as centralizing as execution preconfs, in the sense that execution preconfirmations are very hard to give out. There's a lot of technical and economical sophistication that you need, and proposers are most likely not up for that. So there will be a lot of delegation happening, and in its current stage, we're sort of careful with that because delegation can be dangerous, as also Matthew mentioned. So let's do a quick market analysis. Francesco gave a presentation earlier this week, which we link in the last slide. But what we want to get across is we did a market analysis on the last 20 blocks of data, where we tried to find what the percentage is of preconfirmable transactions. And to reiterate, preconfirmable means that they're not dependent on any order in the block, because inclusion preconfs, they don't commit to anything related to ordering, therefore they're not useful for any state contentious transactions like MEV or trading or something like that. And it turns out that actually 60% of all of the transactions on Ethereum landed in the last 20 days of blocks, not 20 blocks, are preconfirmable in that sense. And taking a look at what they pay, the mean is actually 2.3 Gwei with a median of 1.2 Gwei. So we believe that's fairly low, and with an improved user experience and this guaranteed settlement that inclusion preconfs can provide, we believe that proposers can justify a higher fee. So let's do also a quick analysis on some modeling. So we're going to do a very simple exercise where validators set a minimum priority fee of 3 Gwei when they start up their sidecar, and they won't accept any preconfirmations that are lower than that. And then we model this for different levels of market participation, so 10% up to 100% of all of those preconfirmable transactions. And what we end up with, looking at like the middle sort of market coverage, is with a fixed minimum fee of 3 Gwei, which is not extremely high, validators can anticipate a 2% to 7% increase in block value, all the way up to something like 12% if there's a 100% market coverage. And just to reiterate, this is the execution block value. This is not the total like APY change. Okay, now that we have it clear why inclusion preconfs are potentially interesting, why Bolt? Like, what are the sort of design principles that we have when designing this? And let's start with proposer centricity. So we think it's very important for proposers to retain autonomy because there are a ton of proposers with all of their different preferences, jurisdictions, and stuff like that. And we believe that contributes a lot to censorship resistance, as well as it's simple and it's objective. Maybe this is more clear if I contrast this with delegation. There is a trusted relationship in delegation, meaning that things become more subjective and you don't necessarily know who is at fault in various scenarios. So we think that that can potentially add to the complexity as well as the danger of running a pre-confirmation protocol. Resource efficiency is sort of downstream of that. Obviously, if you want proposers to run this, or node operators or whatever, you want the software to be extremely lightweight. So performance, efficiency, and reliability really are top priorities. It's built in Rust by experienced developers, and it's fully open source if you want to go check it out. And just to go and back that up with some numbers, we've been running a Holesky deployment with around 2% of the Holesky validators. And the memory never exceeds 200 megabytes, and CPU out of 12 cores never really exceeds like 3% of CPU usage. So we're pretty optimistic about that and can probably get it down even more. So yeah, this is like resource efficiency and why we think it's important. On the security side, obviously, same story. If you want proposers to run this, you need to be very careful. There are signing operations involved, and one way that we deal with it is we only require the validator to sign once to authenticate everything, and from then on they can use different keys. This sign once signature is on a different signing domain so that the signature is never valid anywhere else outside of this specific application. We also implemented fallback block building in the case of PBS faults. So again, this comes back to subjectivity. Like if there is a failure, it should always point to the proposer. And like if the relay or the builder fails, that should never lead to slashing. And that's why we have both like a proof-based system and fallback block building in case anything like downstream in the PBS pipeline fails. In terms of testing, we also have full end-to-end tests with a custom kurtosis devnet, multiple audits on the way, and we will have deployment templates with best practice security in mind. Finally, economic viability, another important point. We wanted there to be no opportunity cost for running Bolt software except the minimal collateral posting and potentially the risk, which we want to bring down to close to zero. We wanted it to be fully compatible with PBS from the start, and we wanted inclusion preconfs to not interfere with any MEV revenue, thus making it sort of an uncorrelated revenue stream. Great, okay. Let's talk about some of the more technical stuff, like how Bolt works on the off-chain part and on the on-chain part. So off-chain, this diagram has shown it before. What I want to add here is that we add in an execution layer that all validators are already running, and the Bolt sidecar will leverage that for all of the heavy lifting. Examples are simulating transaction validity and potentially in the future getting priority fee hints based on congestion. These are all JSON RPC methods that your execution client exposes. Thus, the sidecar itself doesn't really need to do a whole lot of additional work. On the MEV boost part, so if you look back, MEV boost is also slightly changed and extended with the constraints API. We have fork diffs. They are very minimal. They are going to go under. They are going to undergo separate audits just to make sure that everything is very secure. There's one sidecar per beacon node, same as your current MEV boost setup. And yeah, that's about it on the off-chain part. But zooming in on the Bolt sidecar, again, this is the most important part, so I want to make sure that we get it right. It's responsible for accepting or rejecting inclusion requests based on what they pay, based on their validity. It turns these commitments, if accepted, into constraints that it communicates down to the builder network, and it stores a fallback block with all of the commitments that were made. It also verifies the proofs from builders. Again, PBS failures should never result in slashing, so that's why the proof part is there. Now, a quick side note on delegation. If it turns out that for some reason there are entities that do not want to run this themselves, we are working on delegation. So first of all, what is delegation? Delegations will allow trusted third parties to sort of sign commitments and constraints on behalf of the proposer. This is useful if you don't want to run it yourself, but there are various tricky and subjective relationships that we want to get right. So this will not be immediately supported, and we're currently actively working on that. Cool. On the on-chain part, there are two important things. So the validator first needs to register and authenticate themselves inside of a validator registry. In this diagram, it's labeled as the Bolt validators contract. When doing that, they appoint a certain operator, which is just an on-chain identity that's registered in the Bolt manager, and that operator has restaked some collateral or staked some collateral through either symbiotic or eigenlayer and registered a RPC endpoint that they will accept preconfirmations on. The operator and the validator, depending on how you run it, will probably be the same entity, but it could, in the case of delegation, it will be someone else, right? Then any consumers, like the Bolt RPC or any routers, they can read from the Bolt validators and Bolt manager contract to get the correct endpoint to send preconfs to, and then route those transactions from users. There's also the Bolt challenger contract, which I'm going to explain a bit more. So this contract is related to opening and resolving challenges. Faults can be proven through challenge games. So anyone can sort of submit a signed commitment from the proposer if they believe it was breached. Proposers can then resolve, this will start a challenge window, same as with optimistic rollups. And proposers can then resolve these challenges by using Merkle inclusion proofs against the beacon block root contract on-chain. So again, completely objective. There's no subjectivity involved at all in the default case. And safety and liveness faults, importantly, they can be distinguished. So if something happened with the proposer and they weren't able to propose their block, the penalty can be either removed or sort of lessened as compared to safety faults. This is still a bit like ongoing research. Cool. Let's talk about the future of Bolt. So I mentioned that Bolt is a proposer commitments protocol, of which inclusion preconfs are a subset. Now, it allows users to interact with proposers by obtaining commitments from them, but I sort of left out what these commitments could be and how we're thinking about those. So other proposer commitments that we're interested in, obviously, are execution preconfs, which we're also actively investigating. If we can find a design that is credible, sufficiently trustless and censorship resistant, and makes economic sense, also important, we will definitely try to implement that into Bolt. One of the research avenues that we find very promising are the subslot auctions research done by Nethermind, because they're sort of on a good trade-off in the decentralization, like performance trade-off curve. So other proposer commitments are block space futures. Here you can buy a certain amount of gas ahead of time and redeem that for a transaction batch just before the proposal. This can be useful for applications that require some form of predictable settlement or want to like hedge their gas costs. But again, this is tricky to implement in a fully trustless way, but we're spending a lot of resources trying to figure that out. And in the based/shared sequencing ecosystem, there's also a lot of potential for the proposer to be involved. Real-time L1, L2 interoperability always will require opt-in from the L1 proposer. And the L1 proposer could sell priority state access to sophisticated sequencers, gateways, and solvers without like delegating everything completely. So you can make it an auction sort of instead of like delegating everything, which we're which we're a fan of. Cool. In terms of current status, we are currently testing on Holesky with our own validators. There are 2 audits planned by the end of this year, and we are ready to start onboarding node operators for testing next week. So there is a form if you would like to participate in cohort 1. I don't know if there are any node operators in the room, but this will get you into our Telegram group, and we will follow up with any instructions if you want to start testing this. In terms of mainnet, when mainnet currently planned tentatively for Q1 2025, there are obviously like some external dependencies like audits that we don't control, but this is what we're trying to aim for, and we're going to take that seriously. So yeah, that was it. Thank you for your time. Any questions? Connor, I think.
Yeah, it's Connor. Can you maybe just expand a little bit on what you mean by proof-based?
So the inclusion proofs, they show up in 2 places. If a proposer makes a commitment and they want to communicate that to builders, they send these constraints. But obviously they can't, in the current MEV boost, they can't really check the payload to see if those constraints are met because they don't have the payload, they sign it blindly. But if you attach inclusion proofs against the transactions root, which is a part of the header, you can trustlessly verify if you trust Merkle inclusion proofs, which are pretty secure, that those constraints are met. Additionally, in the slashing part, again, we rely on Merkle inclusion proofs. For each block, there is a beacon block root that is stored in a contract. If you sign a commitment saying, okay, this transaction is going to be included in this slot, and it didn't happen, you can provide someone can open a challenge, and if you are not able to provide an inclusion proof, a valid inclusion proof of that transaction against a block root at that slot, you will be slashed. So that's what I mean when I say everything is sort of proof-based. There's no like committee determining, oh, this guy was at fault or anything else. It's purely objective.
Nice, yeah, that makes sense.
Thank you, Jonas. That was amazing. A couple questions I have, just briefly. One of them is, you mentioned guaranteed settlement if you have confirmation from the proposer. If you have enough proposers and testers, right, can you do guaranteed finality, and is that something that you've thought about?
I mean, finality is an interesting word. Finality sort of usually
let me correct that a little bit. I mean,
okay.
Reducing the risk of a reorg and like increasing the likelihood of reaching like Ethereum finality.
Oh, I see. Yeah, I mean, you could get commitments from all of them in the look-ahead, and they will all be bound to include that transaction. So even if a reorg happens, you'll probably get included in the next block, which is like you sort of simulate finality. It's not consensus-based finality. Yep. But it's based on the promise of each of the proposers in the look-ahead that they will include that transaction. So yes, if you can get a commitment from all of them, yes.
Cool, and then one more, and I'd love to talk to you afterwards. So you mentioned that about 60% of Ethereum transactions in the last 20 days have been pre-confirmable, so independent of sub-block state, I guess, independent of block ordering. What percent of value do these have to the proposer? So we saw that priority fee graph, which is useful at the distribution. But my question is about priority fee, also MEV, kind of these 60%, what percent of like the proposer value do they actually make up?
Not the most of it, definitely. The most comes from MEV. I can't give you an exact number, but like I know that MEV gives more.
If you had to guess, like 20%?
You know it? How much? 20. There we go. Around 20.
Okay, cool, thank you.
Awesome.
If there aren't any more questions, thank you very much. Super interesting.
Thank you.